And sort of connected to that, and this is maybe leading on to the next question as well. If one looks at Marx and his writings on the French peasantry versus the much later writing on the Russian peasantry, one could probably see a massive difference in the ways in which he's talking about the peasantry, class differentiation. In my reading of your classes of labor argument, for example, I saw a lot of confirmation in later writings by Marx, where he's talking about the lack of complete differentiation and the possibility for this to be an extended scenario, even within conditions of capitalist agriculture. So the question that I wanted to lead on to was a key category that a lot of people who work on agrarian change or on peasant politics or peasant economies use: primitive accumulation. Seems to be very current, seems to be coming back in all kinds of different literatures. In my reading of your work, and I have to confess I've not read all of your work, but I've read most of your work, including your highly condensed and very well received book from a few years ago, it doesn't figure much in your writing. So why does primitive accumulation not figure in your writing, and how does that sort of indicate how you read capitalism and sort of capitalist development?
Very good question again, and you're quite right. I haven't touched on it much. Now, I have unwritten papers on primitive accumulation, the latest version of which I gave at a workshop in Oxford last summer, organised by Barbara Harris-White and Muhammad Ali Jun. And I need to get back to that and develop it. Basically, I'm quite critical of a lot of contemporary uses of primitive accumulation, which I regard as fairly promiscuous, in fact. One can try to understand why it's reappeared. I think its biggest claims to attention in contemporary literatures is not so much in agrarian studies, but in trying to theorize contemporary imperialism and various conceptions of appropriation of assets, and indeed even appropriation of surplus labor or surplus value from the South in ways that are quite different from Marx's classic model in Capital. David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession is obviously a leading example of that. But I think in what I would still broadly and not unsympathetically call third worldist political economy, primitive accumulation has made a big comeback, that's for sure. My own view is, well, I suppose twofold. One is, I think primitive accumulation is better understood historically as a moment, of course a global moment, in the history of capitalist world economy, which I would say was more or less over by the late 19th, early 20th century, which was the context from where it fed into Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism. If you look at the examples that she deployed as more or less contemporary. And I think those examples are actually, for differences of place and differences of what, 4 or 5 decades, are very similar to the examples deployed by Marx. The second point I would make is that, and it's a peculiar kind of mirror image which we get a lot in these debates, is that in order to argue for primitive accumulation as such a central dynamic in contemporary imperialism, that is done against a very reified model of capitalist, or classic capitalist accumulation developed by Marx in Capital. In other words, there is a way of sort of reifying that and abstracting it historically, so that everything that is different from that, the appropriation of surplus value through real subsumption of labour and so on, is seen as somehow goes to another residual, a category that is residual, called primitive accumulation. So it's as if you took from Marx's Capital the notion that capitalism ceases to involve predation, violence, and so on, as it develops in its world history, which I think is quite a wrong reading of Marx. Its main impact, perhaps on agrarian studies, has been through the idea of land grabs. And there's some very good writing about contemporary land grabs, especially writing which focuses on and helps us understand specific circumstances, specific conjunctures, in other words, with due reference to time and place where land grabs are taking place. I think Michael Levian's recent book on India is a good example of that. So for me, invoking land grabs in some very general sense does not in itself demonstrate ongoing primitive accumulation, which of course for many people it does. So those are sources of my skepticism about primitive accumulation. But in preferring not to use it, or in producing a critique of many of its uses, which I should get on with, that's not, so to speak, to portray contemporary capitalism as progressive, as historically necessary, as benign, or any of these things, which is a position perhaps a few Marxists still take, and which I find utterly astonishing.
Yeah, that's a very illuminating answer, Henry. I do agree with you on the promiscuity of the use of this term, and particularly since you brought out the issue of land grabs. For those of us who work on India, the connections, if you like, between high capitalism and land grabs are far too plain to see, to really think of it as something external, really, and to make that separation, which is so artificial, and therefore also probably not very productive in terms of theory or politics.